They said she was worthless, too old, too worn, a burden no man would ever want. Margaret Ellis stood on that auction block in 1885, 56 years old, and about to be sold like livestock by her own blood. The California sun beat down mercilessly as men laughed, pointing at her gray hair, her lined face, her calloused hands. She'd survived a husband's death, raised children who abandoned her, worked herself to the bone, and this was her reward. Humiliation, erasure, the final proof that the world had no place for a woman past her prime. But one broken rancher was about to prove everyone wrong. If you want to see how Margaret reclaimed her life against all odds, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The dust never settled in Merced, California. It hung in the air like judgment itself, coating everything with the same dull brown resignation: the buildings, the horses, the people. Especially the people. In the summer of 1885, Merced was the kind of town where dreams came to die slowly, baked under a relentless sun that showed no mercy to the weak, the poor, or the unwanted. Margaret Ellis had learned long ago that she was all three. She stood now on a makeshift platform in the town square, her wrists bound loosely with a rope, not tight enough to hurt, but visible enough to make the point. She was property, goods to be sold. At 56 years old, with silver streaking through her once dark hair and lines carved deep around her eyes and mouth, she represented the worst kind of investment, a woman past her usefulness, a burden that needed to be offloaded before she cost anyone else another meal. The crowd gathered slowly, drawn by morbid curiosity more than genuine interest. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to meet the gazes of people she'd known for years. Women she'd helped with births and sicknesses, men whose shirts she'd mended when their own wives were too busy, children she'd fed from her own meager supplies when times were hard. None of them spoke up for her now. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas Wardell's voice boomed across the square. He was Margaret's nephew by marriage, a thick-necked man of 40 with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He'd taken control of his late wife's family assets with the enthusiasm of a man who'd been waiting his whole life for exactly this opportunity. "I know this is an unusual offering, but let me assure you, there's value here for the right buyer." Someone in the crowd laughed. The sound cut through Margaret like a blade. "Now, I'll be honest with you folks," Thomas continued, warming to his performance. He walked a slow circle around Margaret as if she were a horse he was trying to sell. "She's not young. She's not pretty. But what she lacks in youth and beauty, she makes up for in sheer stubbornness, I suppose." More laughter. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She'd promised herself that much. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "My late wife's aunt here," Thomas gestured at Margaret with theatrical generosity, "has been a burden on our household for 3 years now. 3 years of feeding her, clothing her, keeping a roof over her head. And what do we get in return? Complaints. Defiance. An ungrateful tongue that never learned when to stay silent." That was a lie. But Margaret knew better than to say so. She'd worked herself to exhaustion in Thomas's household, doing the work of 2 women while being fed like a child. She'd scrubbed floors until her knees bled, tended the garden, cooked, cleaned, mended, and cared for Thomas's 4 children while his new wife, barely 23 years old, spent her days in town gossiping with friends. The one time Margaret had dared to suggest that young Catherine might help more around the house, Thomas had slapped her hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted 2 weeks. "So here's my proposal," Thomas announced, spreading his arms wide to encompass the crowd. "I'm offering this woman's labor for a period of 3 years. She's strong enough for her age, can cook, clean, sew, garden, tend animals. She knows her place and she'll do as she's told. Starting bid is $20. Silence fell over the square. $20 was what you might pay for a decent milk cow or a month's rent on a small house. For 3 years of a human being's labor, it was an insult, but it was also more than anyone was willing to pay. "Come now," Thomas's voice took on an edge of desperation. "Surely someone needs extra help around their property. Think of it as an investment, 3 years of steady work for a one-time payment." "She looks half dead already," someone called out. "Might not last 3 months, let alone 3 years." I'll vouch for her constitution, Thomas shot back. She's tougher than she looks. Survived her husband, raised 3 children, worked in the fields. And where are those children now? A woman's voice cut through the crowd. Margaret recognized it as belonging to Judith Harper, the banker's wife. Seems to me if her own children won't take her in, there's a reason for it. The words landed like stones. Margaret's children, 2 daughters and a son, had scattered to the winds after their father died. Mary had married a merchant and moved to San Francisco, making it clear there was no room in her new life for an aging mother. Ruth had gone east with a railroad man and hadn't written in 4 years. And James had taken what little money his father left and disappeared into the gold fields, chasing dreams that would never materialize. None of them had come when Thomas sent word that he was selling their mother. Perhaps we should lower the starting bid, suggested Harold Crimmins, the owner of the general store. He was a small man with calculating eyes, always looking for a bargain. Say, $10? $10, Thomas sputtered. That's robbery. This woman has years of work left in her. Then you keep her, Harold replied with a shrug. But don't expect us to pay for what you're clearly trying to get rid of. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was worse than she'd imagined. To be sold was humiliating enough, but to be unwanted even at bargain prices? That was a different kind of death, the kind that happened while you were still breathing. $5, someone called out, and that's only because I need help with the harvest. Soon as that's done, she's back to being your problem. Now wait just a minute, Thomas began, but the crowd was already losing interest. People were turning away, heading back to their daily business. The spectacle had been entertaining enough, but nobody wanted to actually spend money on it. This is ridiculous, Thomas's face had gone red with anger and embarrassment. You people are supposed to be good Christian folk, and you won't even help out a widow in need? A widow you're trying to sell like cattle, Judith Harper pointed out coolly. Don't dress it up in charity, Thomas Wardell. We all know what this is. Margaret closed her eyes. Let it end, she thought. Whatever comes next, just let this part be over. I'll make you all a deal, Thomas said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous. Anyone who takes her off my hands can have her for $3. $3, and she's yours for 3 years. That's $1 a year for steady labor. You won't find a better bargain anywhere. $3, the price of 2 bottles of decent whiskey, less than what you'd pay for a good pair of boots. She'll eat more than that in a month, someone muttered, and the crowd made sounds of agreement. Margaret opened her eyes and looked out at the faces staring back at her. She saw pity in some, contempt in others, indifference in most. These were people she'd lived among for decades, people whose joys and sorrows she'd shared, and not one of them saw her as anything more than a burden, a problem to be avoided. Something hardened inside her chest. Fine, she thought. If this is what the world thinks I'm worth, then I'll accept it. But I won't forget it either. $2, Thomas said desperately. $2, and you can have her right now. Take her off my hands and she's your responsibility. $2. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of horses shifting in their traces and the distant bark of a dog. Margaret felt the sun burning the back of her neck, felt the rope chafing her wrists, felt the weight of 56 years pressing down on her shoulders. She'd been 14 when she married Robert Ellis, a man twice her age who needed a wife to cook and clean and bear his children. She'd been 17 when Mary was born, 19 when Ruth arrived, 22 when James finally gave them a son. She'd worked beside Robert in the fields, kept house, raised children, nursed him through 2 bouts of pneumonia and the fever that finally killed him when she was 48. For 8 years after that, she'd managed on her own, taking in washing, mending, baking bread to sell, doing whatever work she could find. She'd kept her small house, her tiny garden, her dignity. She'd been poor but independent, worn but unbroken. Then Thomas had come calling with his new wife and his 4 children, and his claim that family took care of family. He'd convinced her to give up her house, just temporarily, he'd said, and move in with them. He'd promised she'd be comfortable, cared for in her declining years. Within a month, she'd realized her mistake. Within 6 months, she'd understood she was a prisoner. But by then, her house had been sold, her few possessions distributed, her independence shattered. And now this, the final humiliation, the ultimate proof that she had no value, no worth, no future beyond whatever labor her aging body could provide. $1, Thomas said, his voice flat with defeat. $1 and whoever wants her can take her. Otherwise I'm taking her home and she can starve for all I care. I'm done feeding useless mouths. Margaret lifted her chin. If she was going to be sold, she'd at least meet it standing straight. The crowd had gone quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, uncomfortable. Even the hardest hearts in Merced seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something ugly, something that crossed a line between practicality and cruelty. "This ain't right," someone muttered. "She's a person, not livestock." "Then you buy her," Thomas snapped. "Put your money where your righteous mouth is." The speaker, an older man Margaret recognized as one of the ranchers from outside town, looked away. "That's what I thought," Thomas said with grim satisfaction. "Lot of talk, no action. That's Merced in a nutshell, isn't it? Everyone's got opinions, nobody's got the spine to back them up. I'll give you $1 for her." The voice came from the back of the crowd, quiet but clear. People turned to look, creating a gap through which Margaret could see the speaker. He was young, couldn't have been more than 30, with the kind of lean, weathered look that came from hard work and harder times. His clothes were clean but threadbare, patched in places and faded from sun and washing. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes that looked older than the rest of him. Tired eyes. Haunted eyes. Margaret had never seen him before. "Sold," Thomas said immediately, before the stranger could reconsider. $1 for 3 years of labor. What's your name, friend? Caleb Rowe. The man moved through the crowd, pulling a worn leather wallet from his pocket. He counted out coins slowly, carefully, 4 quarters that clinked as they fell into Thomas's waiting palm. "But I'm not buying labor." Thomas's smile faltered. "What?" "I'm paying her bond," Caleb said. He turned to Margaret for the first time, meeting her eyes directly. "Ma'am, if you're willing, I'd like to offer you wages and a place to work. Fair wages. You'd be free to leave any time you choose, but I need help on my ranch, and I'm willing to pay for it honestly." Margaret stared at him. This had to be a trick. Men didn't offer wages to women they bought off auction blocks. They didn't offer freedom to people they paid $1 for. "Don't listen to him," Thomas interjected quickly. "The deal is done. I sold her labor for 3 years, and that's what you purchased." Caleb's eyes never left Margaret's face. "The deal I made was to pay the price you demanded. What happens after that is between me and her. Is that not right, Mr. Wardell?" Thomas's face flushed dark red. "Now you listen here. I paid your $1, Caleb said, his voice still quiet but with steel underneath. "You said whoever wanted her could take her for that price. Well, I paid it. So unless you want to give me my money back and keep her yourself, I'd suggest you untie her hands and let her come with me." The crowd had gone completely silent now, watching this unexpected confrontation with fascination. Thomas looked around, clearly hoping for support, but found none. He'd made his deal, taken his money, and now he was stuck with it. "Fine," he spat, reaching up to roughly untie the rope around Margaret's wrists. "Take her then. But don't come crying to me when you realize what a burden she is. Don't say I didn't warn you." The rope fell away. Margaret rubbed her wrist slowly, feeling blood flow back into her hands. She should move, she knew. Should step down from the platform, accept this stranger's offer, get away from Thomas and this nightmare as quickly as possible. But her legs wouldn't obey. 56 years of being told what to do, where to go, how to be useful, had taught her to wait for instructions. Even now, even in this moment, she couldn't quite believe she had any choice in the matter. Caleb seemed to understand. He stepped closer to the platform, near enough that only Margaret could hear him when he spoke. "Ma'am, I know you don't know me from Adam, and I know this must seem like jumping from one bad situation to another. But I swear to you, I'm offering honest work for honest pay. You'd have your own room, your own space. I need help running my ranch, and I'm willing to pay $3 a month plus room and board. If you want to leave after a week, a month, a year, that's your choice. I won't stop you." $3 a month. That was more than most women made, more than Margaret had seen in years. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" Caleb's expression shifted, something painful flickering across his features. "Because everybody deserves a choice, ma'am. And it seemed like yours got taken away." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something she recognized: loss. This man knew what it meant to have everything stripped away. He understood, in a way these townspeople never could, what it felt like to be at the mercy of others. Maybe that made him dangerous. Or maybe it made him the only honest person in this whole damned town. "What's your name, ma'am?" Caleb asked gently. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Ellis. Mrs. Ellis." He offered his hand to help her down from the platform. "Would you be willing to come work at my ranch?" She looked at his outstretched hand, calloused, scarred, but steady. Then she looked back at Thomas, who was watching with barely concealed fury. Then at the crowd, already dispersing, already forgetting about her. Then at the town of Merced, where she'd spent so many years being useful, being needed, being worth something. None of them wanted her anymore. Maybe it was time to stop wanting them back. Margaret reached out and took Caleb Rowe's hand. His grip was firm but not crushing, supporting her as she stepped down from the platform. Her legs shook slightly, but she stayed upright. "I'll come with you," she said clearly, loud enough for Thomas and anyone else still listening to hear. "And I'll take you up on that offer of honest work." "Thank you, ma'am," Caleb said. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his expression eased. "My wagon's just over there. I've got a few supplies to pick up at the general store, and then we can head out to the ranch. It's about 8 miles north of town." I had some things," Margaret said, then stopped. "No, never mind. There's nothing I need from that house." Thomas made a disgusted sound. "Ungrateful to the last. Don't say I didn't try to help you, Aunt Margaret." Margaret turned to face him fully. For 3 years she'd bitten her tongue, swallowed her pride, accepted his abuse because she'd had nowhere else to go. But that was over now. "You tried to sell me like an animal," she said, her voice steady and cold. "You worked me like a slave and fed me like a stray dog. You took everything I had and then tried to auction off what was left. Don't you dare call that help, Thomas Wardell. Don't you dare pretend you were anything but a coward and a bully." Thomas's face went purple. "You watch your mouth, old woman." "She doesn't have to watch anything anymore," Caleb interrupted. His voice was still quiet, but there was something in it that made Thomas take a step back. "She's not your property. She's not your responsibility. She's not anything to you anymore. And if I see you or anyone from your household anywhere near my ranch, we're going to have a problem. Are we clear?" Thomas sputtered, looking around for support that didn't materialize. Finally, he spat in the dirt at Margaret's feet and stalked off, shoving through the remaining crowd. Margaret watched him go, feeling something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "Mrs. Ellis?" Caleb's voice brought her back. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. "Yes, I think I am." "Good. Let's get those supplies and head home." Home. The word echoed strangely. Margaret hadn't had a home in 3 years. Hadn't had a real home, a place that was truly hers, in even longer than that. She followed Caleb through the dusty street to his wagon, a sturdy but worn vehicle pulled by 2 horses that looked as tired as their owner. While he went into the general store, Margaret stood by the wagon, feeling the eyes of the town on her back. Let them look, she thought. Let them wonder. Let them judge. She was done caring what Merced thought of her. Caleb emerged with a small bag of supplies, flour, salt, a few other basics, and loaded them into the wagon bed. Then he helped Margaret up onto the seat beside him, his hands respectful, never lingering longer than necessary. "It's a bit of a rough ride," he warned as he climbed up beside her. "The road out to my place isn't much more than a trail, but the horses know the way." "I've ridden rough roads before," Margaret said. Caleb nodded and flicked the reins. The horses started forward, and Merced began to fall away behind them. For the first few miles, neither of them spoke. Margaret watched the landscape change from dusty town to scrubland, to the beginning of rolling hills. The August heat was fierce, but there was a breeze picking up from the west, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and distant water. "I should tell you," Caleb said finally, breaking the silence, "the ranch isn't much right now. I've been having some difficulties. The house is sound and there's a good well, but the fences need mending and I'm behind on just about everything else. I can't promise it'll be easy work." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Margaret replied. "What I'm afraid of is lies. So if you're going to tell me something, tell me the truth. What are these difficulties you're talking about? Caleb was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as if he was chewing over how much to share. Finally, he spoke. I had a wife, he said. Sarah. We built that ranch together, worked it together. 3 years ago, she got sick. Fever that wouldn't break. By the time I got her to a doctor in Fresno, it was too late. She died 2 days later. I'm sorry, Margaret said softly. After that, I let things slide. Couldn't seem to care about the ranch, about keeping things running. Lost some cattle, lost some land to creditors. I'm still holding on to the main house and about 40 acres, but it's a near thing. I need help getting the place back to what it was, but I can't afford regular hired hands. That's why I was in town today, seeing if there was any day labor available, maybe someone willing to work for reduced wages until I could get back on my feet. And instead you found me, Margaret said. Instead I found you, Caleb agreed, and I figured $3 a month was a fair wage for someone willing to help cook, clean, maybe tend a garden. And the truth is, Mrs. Ellis, I could use the company. It gets lonely out there, talking to horses and cattle all day. Margaret studied his profile as he drove, the strong line of his jaw, the sad set to his eyes, the way his shoulders carried weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. This was a man who'd lost everything that mattered and was trying to claw his way back to something resembling life. She understood that feeling better than he knew. I can cook and clean, she said, and I know my way around a garden. I can also mend fences if you show me how, tend animals, do whatever needs doing. I'm stronger than I look. I don't doubt that, ma'am. And Mr. Rowe? You can call me Margaret. Mrs. Ellis makes me feel like I'm back in that house, being reminded of my place every 5 minutes. Caleb glanced at her, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched his lips. All right, Margaret, and you can call me Caleb. They rode on as the sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. Margaret felt sweat trickle down her back, felt her throat go dry, but she didn't complain. She'd endured worse than heat. Can I ask you something? Caleb said after another long stretch of silence. You can ask. Whether I answer is another matter. Fair enough. He paused. Your nephew said you had children. 3 of them. Are they alive? As far as I know. Do they care? Apparently not. Margaret kept her voice flat, emotionless. She'd cried all the tears she had over her children's abandonment. There were none left. They have their own lives now. I'm not part of them. I'm sorry, Caleb said quietly. That must hurt. It did. Now it's just fact. Like saying the sky is blue or water is wet. My children don't want me. That's just how things are. Well, Caleb said slowly, for what it's worth, I think they're fools. Anyone can see you're worth more than what that town gave you credit for. Margaret turned to look at him fully. You don't know me, Caleb. You saw me on an auction block for 10 minutes and paid $1 to get me off it. That's kindness, maybe even pity, but it's not knowledge. For all you know, I could be everything Thomas said I was. Ungrateful, difficult, more trouble than I'm worth. Are you? I don't know anymore, Margaret admitted. I used to think I knew who I was. A good wife, a good mother, a hard worker. But life has a way of grinding those certainties down to dust. Maybe I am difficult. Maybe I am ungrateful. All I know for sure is that I'm tired and I'm angry and I'm so goddamn sick of being treated like I'm invisible. The curse slipped out before she could stop it. Margaret immediately tensed, waiting for a reprimand. Thomas had slapped her once for using unladylike language. But Caleb just nodded. I can understand that. And for what it's worth, I can promise you this much. You won't be invisible on my ranch. There's too much work that needs doing for me to overlook anyone willing to do it. They crested a hill, and the landscape opened up before them. Margaret could see a small house in the distance, weathered but sturdy, with a barn beside it and fencing that had definitely seen better days. Scrubland stretched out in all directions, dotted with a few cattle grazing lazily in whatever shade they could find. That's it, Caleb said. The Rowe Ranch. What's left of it, anyway? As they drew closer, Margaret could see more details. The house needed paint, and one of the shutters hung crooked. The barn door was slightly off its hinges. The garden plot beside the house was mostly weeds, but the bones of the place were good. She could see that. With work, with care, it could be something again. "It's honest," she said finally. "That's more than I can say for a lot of places." Caleb pulled the wagon up beside the house and set the brake. He climbed down, then came around to help Margaret down. Her legs protested as her feet hit the ground. The ride had been longer and rougher than she'd admitted to herself, but she stayed upright through sheer stubbornness. "Come on inside," Caleb said. "I'll show you around, such as it is." The house was small, a main room that served as kitchen and living space, 2 bedrooms, and not much else. But it was clean, if sparse, and the roof looked sound. Caleb led her to one of the bedrooms, which held a simple bed frame with a thin mattress, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the scrubland. "This would be yours," he said. "I know it's not much." "It's private," Margaret interrupted. "That makes it a palace compared to where I've been sleeping." For the past 3 years, she'd slept in a corner of Thomas's kitchen, on a pallet that she had to roll up every morning. No door, no privacy, no space that was truly hers. This room, small and plain as it was, felt like luxury. "There's a trunk in the barn with some of Sarah's old clothes," Caleb said, his voice careful. "I know it might seem strange, but you're about her size and they're just sitting there unused. You're welcome to them if you want." Margaret understood what this cost him, offering his dead wife's belongings to a stranger. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll take good care of them." Caleb nodded, looking relieved to have that settled. "Kitchen's got basic supplies. Well is out back. Water's good and cold. Outhouse is beside the barn. I've got 6 head of cattle, 2 milk cows, those 2 horses, and a handful of chickens that mostly fend for themselves. We can work out a routine for chores, but I'm not expecting you to do everything. I hired you to help, not to be a slave." "What time do you want breakfast?" Margaret asked. "Whenever you get around to it. I've been making do with coffee and whatever's easy. Actual meals haven't been much of a priority." Margaret looked around the sparse kitchen, taking inventory. Flour, salt, a few tins of beans, some dried meat. It wasn't much, but she'd worked with less. "I'll make dinner tonight," she said, "and we'll see about getting that garden back in shape tomorrow. Even this late in the season, we can probably get some greens going." "You don't have to start right away," Caleb protested. "You've had a hard day. You should rest." "Mr. Rowe." "Caleb," Margaret corrected herself. "I've been resting for 3 years, and it nearly killed me. What I need now is to be useful, to prove to myself that I still can be. So if it's all the same to you, I'd like to start earning my keep." Caleb studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But if you need anything, if you want to rest, if this gets to be too much, you tell me. Deal?" "Deal," Margaret agreed. As Caleb headed back outside to tend the horses, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen of this stranger's house, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back and the promise of $3 a month. She should have been terrified. She should have been mourning everything she'd lost, her youth, her children, her dignity. Instead, for the first time in years, Margaret Ellis felt something that might have been hope. It was fragile, uncertain, as likely to shatter as to hold. But it was there, flickering in her chest like a candle in the dark. She'd been sold for $1. She'd been told she was worthless, used up, too old to matter. Maybe it was time to prove them all wrong. Margaret rolled up her sleeves, found an apron hanging on a hook, and got to work. The first week passed in a blur of work that left Margaret's body aching and her mind mercifully quiet. She woke before dawn each morning, lit the stove, and had coffee brewing by the time Caleb emerged from his room. They'd fallen into an unspoken routine. He'd drink his coffee standing at the window, watching the sun rise over the scrubland, while she prepared a simple breakfast of eggs from the handful of chickens and whatever bread she'd managed to bake the day before. They didn't talk much during those early mornings. Margaret appreciated that. She'd spent 3 years listening to Thomas's constant criticism, his new wife's shrill complaints, the children's demands. The silence of the Rowe Ranch felt like a balm on an old wound. After breakfast, Caleb would head out to work the fences or check on the cattle, and Margaret would attack the house with the kind of fury that came from years of pent-up frustration. The place wasn't dirty, exactly. Caleb had kept it clean enough for a man living alone, but it had the hollow feeling of a home that had stopped being lived in and become merely occupied. She scrubbed floors that didn't need scrubbing, beat rugs until no more dust would come out, washed windows until they gleamed. She found Sarah's clothes in the trunk Caleb had mentioned, simple dresses, a few skirts and blouses, all carefully folded and smelling faintly of lavender. Margaret held each piece for a moment before trying it on, feeling the ghost of the woman who'd worn them before. Sarah had been taller than Margaret, but thinner, so the clothes hung a bit loose, but they were clean and whole and infinitely better than the threadbare rags Thomas had allowed her. On the third day, Margaret tackled the garden. What had once been a productive plot was now mostly weeds and hard-packed earth. She spent hours on her knees in the brutal sun, pulling weeds, turning soil, coaxing life back into ground that had been neglected too long. Her hands blistered, her back screamed in protest. Her knees ached with a deep bone-grinding pain that she knew would only get worse with age. She didn't care. The pain meant she was doing something, creating something, mattering. Caleb found her there that evening, still working despite the fading light. He stood watching for a moment before speaking. "Margaret, you don't have to do all this in a week." She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I know, but I want to. This garden could be producing food by fall if we get it right. Save us money at the store." "We've got money for the store." "Do we?" Margaret looked up at him directly. "Because from what I've seen, Caleb, you're about 2 bad months from losing this place entirely. The fences are falling apart. You've got maybe 6 productive cattle when you should have 30, and you're living on coffee and beans because you can't afford better. So no, I don't think we've got money to waste at the store when we could be growing our own food." Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment Margaret thought she'd pushed too far. Thought he'd react like Thomas would have, with anger and recrimination. Instead, he let out a long breath and sat down on the ground beside her, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been telling myself it's not that bad, that I can turn it around, but the truth is, I've been drowning for 2 years. Ever since Sarah died, I couldn't seem to care enough to fix it." "And now?" Margaret asked. Caleb was silent for a moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. "Now I've got someone here who's depending on me to keep my word. I promised you wages and a place to stay, and I aim to keep that promise, which means I need to actually make this ranch work again." "Then let's make it work," Margaret said. "I'm not afraid of hard labor, and you strike me as a man who knows what he's doing when he puts his mind to it. Between the two of us, we can bring this place back." "Why?" The question came out raw. "Why do you care? You could leave any time. Go to another town, find easier work. Why stay here and break your back for a place that isn't even yours?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Why was she working herself to exhaustion for a stranger's failing ranch? Why hadn't she taken Caleb's offer of wages and gone looking for something better, easier, less likely to end in failure? "Because," she said finally, "this is the first place in years where I felt like a person instead of a burden. You don't hover over me, criticizing every move. You don't make me feel like I should be grateful for scraps. You pay me what you promised. You say thank you when I cook dinner, and you treat me like I have a brain in my head and a right to use it. That might not seem like much to you, Caleb, but to me, it's everything." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and Margaret saw something shift in his expression, recognition maybe, understanding. "I know what it's like," he said quietly, "to feel like you don't matter anymore. After Sarah died, people in town stopped seeing me as Caleb Rowe, rancher. I became that poor widower, or the man who let his wife die, or the one who's losing his land. Stopped being a person and became a story they told at church socials." "Is that why you came to the auction?" Margaret asked. "Because you knew what it felt like to be turned into something less than human?" "Partly," Caleb admitted. "Also because I watched them put you up on that block like you were a piece of furniture, and all I could think was, that could have been Sarah if I'd died first and her family had gotten their hands on her. Her father never thought she should have married me. Would have loved an excuse to sell her off to someone who could make better use of her." Margaret felt something crack in her chest. "You bought me because of her, because of what might have happened to your wife." "No," Caleb said firmly. "I stopped the auction because of her. I offered you a choice because of you, because I could see in your eyes that you were still fighting, still refusing to break. And I thought, here's someone who deserves better than what she's getting. Someone worth taking a chance on. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky. Two broken people in the middle of nowhere, pretending they could fix what couldn't be fixed. But maybe, Margaret thought, that was enough. Maybe pretending was how you started. Maybe believing came later. Come on, Caleb said finally, getting to his feet and offering her a hand up. It's too dark to work anymore, and you must be starving. I'll help you make dinner. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but Sarah always said cooking was better with company, and I'm starting to remember she was right about most things. Margaret took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her knees protested, her back ached, and she was fairly certain she'd have new blisters by morning. But as they walked back to the house together, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she was home. The routine continued through the second week, but with a subtle shift. Caleb started showing her how to mend the fences, teaching her which wires to twist and how to set posts properly. Margaret taught him how to make bread that didn't come out like rocks, how to season beans so they actually tasted like something. They worked side by side more often, talking about the ranch, about what needed to be done, about small dreams for the future. We could get more chickens, Margaret said one evening as they worked on replacing a section of fence. 24 would give us enough eggs to sell some in town, bring in a little extra money. Good idea, Caleb agreed, hammering in a post. And if we can get the south pasture cleaned up, we could take on some cattle for other ranchers, charge for grazing rights. Is there money in that? Not much, but some. Every little bit helps. Margaret twisted wire around the post, her hand steady despite the blisters. How much do you owe, Caleb, in total? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed. About $300 spread across 2 creditors in Fresno. If I can't pay at least $50 by the end of October, they're going to foreclose. Take the land, the house, everything. $300? It might as well have been $3,000. Margaret's entire year's wages would only be $36. Then we'd better make this ranch profitable fast, she said, refusing to let the impossibility of it show in her voice. Margaret, don't, she interrupted. Don't tell me it's hopeless. Don't tell me we can't do it. I've spent too many years being told what I can't do, what isn't possible, what I should accept. I'm done with that. If we've got until October, then we've got 2 months to make a miracle, and I'm too stubborn to fail. Caleb looked at her, and something like hope flickered across his face. You know you're crazy, right? Probably, Margaret agreed, but at least I'm usefully crazy. That night, they sat at the kitchen table and made lists. Everything the ranch had, everything it needed, everything they could possibly do to bring in money. It wasn't encouraging. They were starting from almost nothing, but it was something, a plan, a direction. We could sell some of my wife's things, Caleb said reluctantly, looking at the numbers. The good china, some jewelry she had. I've been holding on to it, but no, Margaret said firmly. Those are your memories, Caleb. We're not that desperate yet. But I said no. We'll find another way. 3 days later, opportunity found them in an unexpected form. Margaret was hanging laundry when she heard the wagon approaching. She looked up to see an older couple, both weathered by sun and hard work, pulling up to the house. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. "Help you folks?" he called. The man climbed down from the wagon carefully, moving like every joint hurt. "Heard you might take in cattle for grazing. That true?" Caleb glanced at Margaret, surprised. They'd only talked about that possibility a few days ago. "Could be. How many head are we talking about?" 10, maybe 12. My back's gone bad. Can't manage them all anymore. But I hate to sell them. If you could keep them through fall, fatten them up a bit, I'd pay fair." "How fair?" Margaret asked, stepping forward. The woman in the wagon smiled at her, and Margaret nodded back. $1 a head per month?" the man offered. Caleb started to agree, but Margaret cut in. $1.50, and we'll make sure they get the best grazing land. We've got good water, plenty of space, and we'll check on them daily. The man looked surprised, then thoughtful. "You drive a hard bargain, ma'am." "I drive a fair one," Margaret corrected. "Your cattle will be in good hands, and you'll get them back healthier than when you left them. That's worth $1.50. She's got a point, Ben, the woman in the wagon said. And I like her spirit. Take the deal. Ben grinned. All right then, $1.50 it is. I'll bring them by tomorrow. After they left, Caleb turned to Margaret with something between awe and amusement. You just negotiated us an extra $6 a month. Yes, I did, Margaret said calmly, going back to her laundry. And if we're smart about it, we'll get more customers. Word spreads in ranch country. People talk. Have you ever negotiated like that before? No, Margaret admitted. But I spent enough years watching men bargain in the general store to learn how it's done. They always start low, expecting you to counter high, and they settle somewhere in the middle. I just skipped the dance and went straight to what I thought was fair. Caleb shook his head, grinning. Remind me never to play poker with you. Couldn't anyway, Margaret said. I don't know how. I could teach you. Why would I want to learn a game designed to take people's money? Same reason you just negotiated Ben Fletcher up by 50%. Because sometimes you have to play the game to win. That night, Caleb did teach her poker, using dried beans as chips. Margaret lost the first 3 hands spectacularly, then started to catch on to the patterns, the tells, the subtle art of knowing when to hold and when to fold. You're getting better, Caleb said, as she won her 5th hand in a row. I'm a quick learner when I'm motivated, Margaret replied, raking in her pile of beans with satisfaction. They played until late, talking and laughing in a way that felt surprisingly natural. At some point, Margaret realized she was genuinely enjoying herself, not just enduring, not just surviving, but actually taking pleasure in the moment. When had that last happened? She couldn't remember. Word did spread, just as Margaret predicted. Within 2 weeks, they had 26 head of other people's cattle grazing on their land, bringing in $39 a month. It wasn't enough to save the ranch by itself, but it was a start. More than that, it gave them both purpose. They worked dawn to dusk, repairing fences, maintaining water sources, checking on the cattle. Margaret's garden started producing late-season lettuce, some carrots, a surprising abundance of beans. She began baking extra bread and selling it to the other ranchers who came by, adding another few dollars to their monthly income. They were still far from safe, still far from successful, but they were moving in the right direction, and that was more than either of them had been able to say in years. It was in the 4th week that the trouble started. Margaret was in town getting supplies, her first trip back to Merced since the auction, when she saw Thomas. He was coming out of the saloon with 2 other men, all of them well into their afternoon drinking. His face flushed dark red when he spotted her. Well, well, he slurred, changing direction to intercept her. If it isn't the ungrateful aunt. How's life with your new master, old woman? Margaret kept walking, her arms full of packages. Excuse me, Thomas. I have work to get back to. Work? He laughed bitterly. You mean whoring yourself to some desperate widower who couldn't get a real woman? The accusation was so absurd that Margaret almost laughed. Instead, she stopped and turned to face him directly. I mean, honest work for honest wages, she said clearly. Something you'd know nothing about, given how you make your living cheating widows out of their property. Thomas's face went purple. You watch your mouth. Or what? Margaret challenged. You'll hit me again? Sell me again? You've got no power over me anymore, Thomas Wardell. I don't care what you think, what you say, or what lies you tell about me. I'm done with you. That ranch is failing, one of Thomas's companions said. He was a thin man with calculating eyes that Margaret vaguely recognized from the auction. Roe's got debts he can't pay. You'll be back on the auction block by winter. Then I'll deal with that when it happens, Margaret said. But it won't be your concern. She turned to leave, but Thomas grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. You think you're better than us now? Think you're too good for family? Let go of me. Margaret's voice was ice. Make me, old woman. The lady asked you to let go. The new voice came from behind them. Margaret turned to see a stranger, a large man, broad-shouldered and hard-faced, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested money and power. He wasn't from Merced, that much was clear. Thomas's grip loosened slightly. This is family business. Stay out of it. I don't see family, the stranger said mildly. I see a man assaulting a woman in public. So I'll say it again. Let her go. Thomas released Margaret's arm and stepped back, but his face was twisted with rage. This isn't over. he hissed at her before stalking off with his companions. Margaret rubbed her arm where Thomas had grabbed her, feeling the bruise already forming. "Thank you," she said to the stranger. "I had it handled, but I appreciate the intervention." The man studied her with interest. "You work for Caleb Rowe?" Something in his tone made Margaret wary. "I do. Why?" "Just curious. I've heard interesting things about that ranch. Heard it's on the verge of foreclosure." "Then you heard wrong," Margaret said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She collected her packages and headed for the wagon, feeling the stranger's eyes on her back the whole way. Something about that encounter felt wrong, dangerous in a way she couldn't quite name. When she got back to the ranch, she found Caleb working on the barn door, trying to get it to hang straight. She told him about Thomas, about the stranger, about the feeling of being watched. Caleb's expression darkened. "Did this stranger give a name?" "No, but he seemed very interested in our situation." "Describe him." Margaret did, and watched Caleb's jaw tighten with each detail. "That sounds like Marcus Hendricks," Caleb said quietly. "He's a land agent for a consortium based in Fresno. They've been buying up failing ranches all through the valley, supposedly for a railroad expansion." "Is it true? About the railroad?" "Maybe. Or maybe it's just an excuse to consolidate land. Either way, Hendricks has a reputation for pressuring people to sell. Sometimes legally, sometimes not." Margaret felt cold despite the afternoon heat. "You think he's coming after this place?" "I think he's been circling for months," Caleb admitted. "Some of the creditor pressure I've been feeling, I've wondered if it was being orchestrated. Debts called in early, interest rates raised, that kind of thing. If Hendricks wants this land, he'd need me desperate enough to sell." "And now he knows you're not alone anymore," Margaret said, understanding. "He knows you've got help, got income coming in. We're making it harder for him to squeeze you out. Which means he might change tactics." Caleb set down his tools and looked at her seriously. "Margaret, I need you to understand. If Hendricks decides to make trouble, it could get dangerous. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to leave, find safer work." Margaret looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Do I look like someone who runs from trouble?" "No," Caleb admitted, "but I had to offer." Offer noted and refused. "We've got cattle to tend and a ranch to save. I'm not letting some land agent with a fancy suit scare me off." But that night, lying in her small room, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She'd escaped Thomas's household, started to build something like a life here. The thought of losing it, of being forced back into poverty and dependence, terrified her more than she wanted to admit. She must have eventually fallen asleep, because she woke to the sound of shouting and the smell of smoke. Margaret bolted out of bed and ran to the window. The barn was on fire, flames already climbing the walls, illuminating the night with hellish orange light. She could hear the horses screaming inside. She didn't think, just ran. Out of her room, out of the house, straight for the barn. She could see Caleb ahead of her, already fighting with the barn door, trying to get it open against the heat and flames. "The horses!" he shouted when he saw her. "Help me get them out!" Together they wrenched the door open. Smoke poured out, thick and choking. Margaret grabbed her skirt, pressed it against her face, and plunged into the inferno. The horses were wild with panic, rearing and kicking. Margaret grabbed the nearest one's halter, using her weight to pull its head down, forcing it to follow her toward the door. The heat was incredible, searing her skin, stealing her breath. She could barely see through the smoke, could barely hear over the roar of flames. But she got the horse out, and then went back for the second one. Caleb was fighting with it, trying to get a rope on it, but the animal was too panicked. Margaret didn't hesitate. She walked straight up to the terrified horse, put her hands on its nose, and looked it in the eye. "Easy," she said, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "Easy now. Follow me and live. That's all you have to do." The horse's eye rolled white with fear, but it stopped fighting. Margaret took its halter and let it out into the clean air, her lungs screaming for oxygen. Behind them, the barn roof collapsed with a sound like thunder. They stood in the yard, covered in soot and ash, watching the barn burn. There was no saving it now. All they could do was keep the fire from spreading to the house. It took until dawn to get the fire fully out and make sure it wouldn't reignite. By then, Margaret could barely stand. Her hands were burned, her lungs felt like sandpaper, and she was fairly certain she'd never get the smell of smoke out of her hair. But the horses were alive, the house was safe, and she was still standing. "This wasn't an accident," Caleb said, his voice rough with smoke and rage. He showed her the evidence. The door had been barred from the outside, and there were clear signs of accelerant around the base of the building. "Hendricks?" Margaret asked. "Or someone he hired? Either way, this is a message." "Then we'd better send one back," Margaret said grimly. "We're not selling. We're not leaving. And if he wants this land, he's going to have to do a lot worse than burn an empty barn." Caleb looked at her, this woman who was supposed to be too old, too weak, too worn out to matter. This woman who'd just run into a burning building twice to save horses that weren't even hers. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "You know that?" Margaret wiped soot from her face. "I'm stubborn. There's a difference." "No," Caleb said. "There really isn't." As the sun rose over the burned wreckage of the barn, neither of them spoke about what they both knew. The fight was just beginning, and it was going to get worse before it got better. But they also didn't speak about leaving, about giving up, about accepting defeat. Because some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. And somehow, without either of them quite meaning for it to happen, this ranch had become one of those things. They rebuilt the barn with borrowed lumber and sheer determination. Caleb's few remaining friends from better days showed up unasked, bringing tools and strong backs, and the kind of quiet solidarity that didn't require explanation. Margaret fed them all from her garden and the chickens, stretching supplies that shouldn't have fed 3 into meals for 8, and nobody commented on the thin portions or simple fare. By the end of the week, they had something that could charitably be called a barn. It wasn't pretty, and it leaked in 2 corners, but it kept the horses dry and gave them a place to store feed. Margaret considered it a victory. Hendricks didn't. He showed up on a Tuesday morning riding a black horse that probably cost more than the entire Rowe ranch. 2 men flanked him, both wearing guns slung low on their hips in a way that suggested they knew how to use them. Margaret was in the garden when they arrived, but she heard the horses and stood up, wiping dirt from her hands. Caleb emerged from the new barn, his face carefully neutral. "Mr. Hendricks, didn't expect to see you out this way." "No?" Hendricks dismounted with practiced ease. "I thought after your recent misfortune you might appreciate an offer of assistance." "What kind of assistance?" Hendricks pulled a paper from his jacket. "I'm authorized to offer you $400 for this property. That's more than enough to cover your debts with money left over to start fresh somewhere else." Margaret walked over to stand beside Caleb, her presence a silent statement. Hendricks's eyes flicked to her, dismissive and cold. "The ranch isn't for sale," Caleb said evenly. "Be reasonable, Rowe. You lost your barn. You're barely scraping by. Winter's coming, and you won't survive it. Take the money while it's on the table." I said no. $450 then. Final offer." "The answer is still no." Hendricks's pleasant expression hardened. "You're making a mistake. This land is earmarked for progress, for the railroad. Whether you sell or not, you will lose this property. The only question is whether you walk away with something or nothing." "Then I guess we'll find out which it is," Caleb said. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." "Your friend here," Hendricks nodded at Margaret with thinly veiled contempt, "seems like a practical woman. Maybe she can talk sense into you. A woman her age should understand the value of security." Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "This woman understands the difference between security and surrender. I suggest you leave now, Mr. Hendricks, before you embarrass yourself further." One of Hendrick's men laughed, then quickly swallowed it when his boss shot him a glare. Hendricks remounted his horse, his movements sharp with barely contained anger. "You've been warned," he said. "What happens next is on your head." They watched him ride away, dust rising in his wake. Margaret felt Caleb's tension like a physical thing beside her. "That was a threat," she said quietly. "Yes, it was." "What do we do?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "We keep going. What else can we do?" What they did was work harder. Margaret expanded the garden, harvesting everything that was ready and preserving what she could for winter. She taught herself to can beans and tomatoes using jars she'd bought cheap from a widow in town who was moving east to live with her daughter. Caleb reinforced the fences, checked the cattle twice daily instead of once, and started sleeping in the barn with a rifle beside him. Neither of them spoke about the fear that had settled over the ranch like a cold fog. Neither of them acknowledged that they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on a Thursday night in the form of 3 men with torches. Margaret woke to Caleb's urgent whisper at her door. "Margaret, get up. We've got company." She was dressed and out of her room in seconds. Through the window, she could see the figures on horseback, silhouetted against the night sky, torches flickering in their hands. "They're going to burn the house," Caleb said, his voice tight. "I need you to go out the back, get to the Hendersons' place 2 miles east, get help." "Like hell," Margaret said. "You can't face 3 armed men alone." "I'm not asking, and I'm not leaving." She grabbed the spare rifle Caleb kept loaded by the door. "So either we face them together, or you waste time arguing with me while they burn us out. Your choice." Caleb looked at her, jaw working, then nodded sharply. "Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" "Understood," Margaret lied. They stepped out onto the porch together. The 3 riders had stopped about 50 yards from the house, close enough to be seen clearly in the torchlight, but far enough to make shooting difficult. "Evening, Roe," one of them called. His face was hidden in shadow, but his voice was young, maybe early 20s. "Mr. Hendricks wants you to know this is your last chance. Sell now, or there won't be anything left to sell." "Tell Hendricks he can go to hell," Caleb replied, his rifle held steady but not yet aimed. "And you boys should think real hard about whether you want to burn down a man's home for money. That's the kind of thing that follows you." "We ain't burning nothing if you're smart," another voice said. "Just sign the papers, take the money, and walk away. Nobody gets hurt." "Already told your boss, the ranch isn't for sale." The third man, who hadn't spoken yet, urged his horse forward a few steps. "That woman there, she the one from the auction the old whore Wardell was trying to unload?" Margaret felt Caleb tense beside her, felt his anger spike like a physical blow. Before he could respond, she stepped forward. "I'm the woman from the auction," she said clearly. "And I'm also the woman who walked into a burning barn to save horses while you were probably passed out drunk in some saloon. So if you want to call me names, at least make them interesting." The man laughed, but it sounded forced. "You got a mouth on you, old woman." "I've got a rifle too," Margaret said. "And I learned to shoot when I was 12 years old, hunting rabbits to keep my family fed. So before you do something stupid, ask yourself, do you really want to find out if I still remember how?" "She's bluffing," the first man said, but he didn't sound certain. "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "Only one way to find out." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched thin as wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Margaret kept her breathing steady, her hands firm on the rifle. If they rushed the house, she'd have maybe 2 shots before they were on them. She'd have to make them count. "This is stupid," the second man said suddenly. "Hendricks didn't pay us enough to get shot over some worthless ranch. Let's go." "We got our orders. Orders don't mean nothing if we're dead. Come on." After another tense moment, the 3 riders turned their horses and disappeared into the darkness, taking their torches with them. Margaret didn't lower her rifle until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Only then did she start shaking. Caleb gently took the rifle from her hands and guided her back into the house. He poured them both whiskey from a bottle he kept for emergencies, pressing a glass into her trembling hands. "Drink," he ordered. Margaret drank, feeling the burn all the way down. "Did I really just threaten 3 armed men with a rifle I barely know how to use?" "You did," Caleb said, "and you were magnificent. I was terrified. Didn't show." He knocked back his own whiskey in one swallow. "Margaret, I meant what I said before. This is getting too dangerous. You should leave while you still can." "And go where?" Margaret set down her glass, her hands finally steady. "Back to Merced? Back to Thomas? Back to being sold like livestock? No, Caleb. I'd rather die defending this place than live on my knees somewhere else." "You might get that chance," Caleb said grimly. "Hendricks isn't going to stop. Tonight was a warning. Next time, they won't just threaten." "Then we'd better be ready." Margaret stood up, suddenly restless. "We need allies. People who'll stand with us if this turns into a real fight." "I don't have many friends left, Margaret. Most folks around here can't afford to make enemies of men like Hendricks." "What about the ranchers whose cattle we're keeping? They've got a stake in us staying operational." Caleb considered this. Some of them might help, but I won't ask them to risk their own properties for mine. You won't have to ask, Margaret said. I will. Over the next week, Margaret visited every rancher who'd placed cattle with them. She didn't ask for help directly. She was too smart for that. Instead, she talked about the ranch, about their plans, about how they were turning things around. She mentioned casually that there were powerful interests trying to force them out, but they were determined to hold on. And then she waited. Human nature, Margaret had learned over 56 years, was a predictable thing. People didn't like bullies. They didn't like seeing the little guy get crushed. And most importantly, they didn't like threats to their own interests. If Hendricks could force Caleb out, he could force any of them out. One by one, the ranchers started showing up. Not with promises of armed support, that would be too much, but with offers of help. A few extra hands to patrol the property at night, eyes and ears in town to watch for trouble. Information about who Hendricks was paying, who he was threatening, what his next move might be. It wasn't an army, but it was something, a network. A community deciding that enough was enough. You did this, Caleb said one evening as they watched yet another rancher ride away after dropping off information about Hendricks's movements. You built this. We built it, Margaret corrected, by being stubborn enough to survive. September bled into October, and with it came the deadline for Caleb's debts. They'd saved money, scraping together every penny from the cattle boarding, Margaret's bread sales, and a dozen other small ventures. But they were still short, $30 short, to be exact. $30 that might as well have been $300. We could sell the milk cows, Caleb suggested without conviction. They both knew the cows were worth more to them producing milk than they'd get from a sale. Or, Margaret said slowly, we could talk to your creditors, explain the situation, offer to pay the interest now and the principal over time. They won't agree. Hendricks probably has them in his pocket. Maybe. Or maybe they're just businessmen who want their money back. We won't know unless we try. So they went to Fresno together, Margaret in her best dress, Sarah's Sunday dress, actually, which fit better now that she'd put on some weight from regular meals, and Caleb in clothes that had been patched so many times they were more patch than original fabric. The first creditor, a banker named Morrison, heard them out with a face like carved stone. When they finished their proposal, he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Let me understand this correctly, he said. You want me to extend your loan, accept reduced payments, and trust that you'll eventually pay the full amount. All based on the word of a man who's already failed to meet his obligations and a woman who was quite literally sold at auction 2 months ago. That's about the sum of it, Margaret said evenly. Though I'd phrase it differently. We're asking you to invest in success rather than profiting from failure. Morrison's eyebrow rose. Explain. If you foreclose, what do you get? A rundown ranch that you'll have to sell, probably to Mr. Hendricks for whatever he's willing to pay. You'll recover some of your money, maybe most of it, but not all, and certainly not any interest. But if you give us time, we'll pay back every penny plus the full interest. You'll make more money by being patient than by being hasty. That assumes you succeed. Most ranches in your position don't. Most ranches in our position don't have me, Margaret said without a trace of arrogance. I've kept that place running on nothing but stubbornness and spite. Give me time and I'll make it profitable. Morrison studied her for a long moment. You really believe that? I know it. And what collateral do you offer besides confidence? Margaret met his eyes directly. My word. I've never failed to repay a debt in my life, and I don't intend to start now. If we can't pay, I'll work for you personally until the debt is cleared. I'll clean your house, cook your meals, whatever it takes. But we will pay what we owe. Morrison was quiet for what felt like an eternity. Then he pulled out a ledger and made some notes. I'll give you until January, he said finally. Pay the interest now and the principal in 3 installments between now and spring. But if you miss even one payment, I foreclose immediately. No extensions, no second chances. Agreed, Caleb said quickly, before Morrison could change his mind. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Thank her. Morrison nodded at Margaret. She's either the bravest woman I've ever met or the craziest. I haven't decided which. Can it be both? Margaret asked. Morrison actually smiled. I suppose it can. The second creditor was harder. He listened to their proposal, then flatly refused. He wanted his money now, and if they couldn't pay, he'd take the property. Margaret and Caleb left Fresno with one success and one failure, which meant they still needed $30 by the end of the week. They made it back to the ranch after dark, both exhausted and discouraged. As Caleb tended the horses, Margaret went inside to light the lamps and start some coffee. She found an envelope on the kitchen table. It wasn't sealed and there was no name on it, just an envelope that definitely hadn't been there when they left that morning. Margaret opened it with trembling hands. Inside was $30 in bills and a note in unfamiliar handwriting. For the people who stand up to bullies. Don't ask who, just win. Margaret stood staring at the money, her throat tight with emotion. Somewhere out there, someone, one of the ranchers maybe, or someone else who'd heard their story, had decided to help, had risked Hendrix's anger to give them a fighting chance. Caleb found her still standing there, the money clutched in her hands and tears streaming down her face. Margaret? What is it? What's wrong? She handed him the envelope wordlessly, watched his expression shift from concern to confusion to wonder as he read the note and counted the money. This is exactly what we need, he said, his voice rough. This is a miracle, Margaret finished. Someone believes in us, Caleb. Someone thinks we're worth saving. They paid the second creditor the next day, meeting his deadline with an hour to spare. The man counted the money twice, clearly surprised, then grudgingly extended the loan on the same terms Morrison had offered. Walking out of that office, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, not just hope, that had come and gone like waves. This was different, deeper. This was belief. They celebrated that night with a dinner that used up the last of their good supplies, real beef instead of beans, fresh bread with butter, and a pie Margaret had made from the last of the preserved peaches. They ate at the kitchen table, talking about plans for the ranch, about the future, about possibilities that had seemed impossible just months ago. We should expand the cattle boarding, Caleb said. We've got room for at least 30 more head, and the income would put us solidly in the black. And I could increase the garden, Margaret added. Maybe even start selling vegetables in town, not just bread. You know what we need? Caleb leaned back in his chair, more relaxed than Margaret had ever seen him. Pigs. A couple of good breeding sows would give us meat and income both. Chickens, too. Another 24 would double our egg production. They talked until late, building castles in the air, planning a future that felt almost possible. At some point, Margaret realized Caleb was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What? She asked. I was just thinking, he said slowly, about the day I pulled you off that auction block. I thought I was saving you, but the truth is, Margaret, you saved me. This ranch, this life, none of it would exist without you. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. Don't be ridiculous. You're the one who knew what to do, who had the skills. I had given up, Caleb interrupted. After Sarah died, I gave up on everything. I was just going through the motions, waiting for the inevitable. You're the one who made me start fighting again, who showed me it was worth fighting for. Caleb, I need to say this. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. When I look at you, I don't see an old woman past her prime. I see someone brave and strong and worth 10 of anyone else I know. I see someone I admire, someone I care about, more than I probably should. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. You don't mean that. You're just grateful. I'm a lot of things, Caleb said. But grateful doesn't begin to cover it. Margaret, I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Margaret wanted to laugh, wanted to cry, wanted to tell him he was crazy because men didn't fall in love with 56-year-old women who'd been sold at auction. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He meant it, every word. I'm too old for you, she whispered. I'm 25 years older. I don't care. People will talk. They'll say terrible things. Let them. Caleb, you could have anyone. A young woman who could give you children, who could... I don't want anyone else. His grip on her hand tightened. I want you. The woman who ran into a burning barn. The woman who stood down armed men with nothing but nerve. The woman who saved my ranch and my life and my soul. That's who I want, Margaret, if you'll have me." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not the future she'd expected, not the future society said she deserved, but a future worth having, worth fighting for. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared this isn't real, that I'll wake up back in Thomas's house and find out this was all a dream." "Then let's make it real," Caleb said. "Marry me, Margaret. Not because you owe me anything, not out of gratitude or obligation. Marry me because we're better together than apart. Because we've built something worth keeping. Because I love you, and I hope, you might love me too." Margaret thought about saying no. Thought about all the sensible reasons this was a terrible idea. She was too old. It was too fast. People would never accept it. Then she thought about the alternative. Walking away from this. From him. From the life they'd built together. Going back to being invisible, unwanted, a burden on someone else's charity. She'd spent 56 years being practical, being sensible, doing what was expected. Maybe it was time to do what she wanted instead. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you, because you're right, we are better together. And because I do love you, Caleb Rowe, even though I know I shouldn't, even though it's crazy and impossible and probably doomed. I love you anyway." Caleb stood up and pulled her into his arms, and Margaret let herself be held, let herself feel safe and wanted and loved for the first time in longer than she could remember. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight, two broken people who'd somehow managed to put each other back together. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of approaching rain. The ranch needed rain. The whole valley needed it. But Margaret barely noticed. She was too busy being happy. The happiness lasted exactly 3 days. On the third day, a young woman appeared at their door, bruised and bleeding and running for her life. Margaret was kneading bread dough when she heard the horse. The rhythm was wrong, frantic hoofbeats instead of the steady clip-clop of a rider who knew where they were going. She wiped flour from her hands and went to the window just as a figure tumbled from the saddle and collapsed in the dirt of their yard. "Caleb!" Margaret shouted, already running for the door. The girl, she couldn't have been more than 20, was trying to crawl toward the house, leaving a trail of blood behind her. Her dress was torn, her face a mass of bruises, and one eye was swollen completely shut. Margaret reached her first, dropping to her knees beside her. "Easy now," Margaret said, her voice calm despite the rage building in her chest. "You're safe. We've got you." Caleb appeared beside them, his face going hard when he saw the girl's injuries. "I'll get her inside. Margaret, get water and bandages." They got her into Margaret's room, the only bedroom on the ground floor, and onto the bed. The girl was conscious, but barely, mumbling words that didn't quite connect. Margaret brought water and clean cloth, her hands steady, from years of tending injuries, though her heart was racing. "What's your name, honey?" Margaret asked gently as she began cleaning the blood from the girl's face. "Emma," the girl whispered. "Emma Cartwright." "All right, Emma, can you tell me who did this to you?" Emma's good eye focused on Margaret with sudden intensity. "Hendricks, Marcus Hendricks. He said I belonged to him, said I'd agreed to marry him, but I never said yes. I told him no, and he—" She broke down sobbing, her whole body shaking. Margaret put her arms around the girl, holding her while she cried, while Caleb stood in the doorway with murder in his eyes. "How did you get away?" Caleb asked when Emma's sobs had quieted to hiccups. "His men were drinking, celebrating," they said. "I waited until they were drunk and took one of the horses, rode as hard as I could. I didn't know where else to go. My father works for Hendricks. He won't help me, won't go against his boss." "You did right coming here," Margaret said firmly. "You're safe now. Hendricks won't touch you while I'm breathing." "He'll come for me," Emma said, fresh fear in her eyes. "He doesn't let things go. If he finds out I'm here, then he finds out," Caleb said. "And he learns that some lines you don't cross." Margaret cleaned and bandaged Emma's injuries as best she could. The girl had bruises everywhere, a split lip, and what Margaret suspected were cracked ribs based on how she gasped when pressure was applied to her left side. But nothing seemed broken beyond healing, and there was no sign of worse violations, though Margaret checked carefully while Emma wept with shame and relief. "You sleep now," Margaret told her, pulling a quilt up to Emma's chin. "We'll keep watch. Nobody's getting to you here." Emma's eyes were already closing, exhaustion and shock pulling her under. Margaret left her sleeping and found Caleb in the kitchen, loading his rifle with movements that spoke of cold fury. "We need to get word to the sheriff," Margaret said. "The sheriff is in Hendrix's pocket," Caleb replied flatly. "Has been for months. He won't do a damn thing except maybe tell Hendrix where she is." "Then what do we do?" Caleb set the rifle down and looked at her. "We protect her, and we make it clear that Hendrix has gone too far. He'll come with men, guns. He'll say she's his property, his intended—" "She's not property," Caleb cut her off, his voice like steel. "She's a human being who said no. That's all that matters." Margaret nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. They'd stood up to Hendrix before, but this was different. This was personal for him now, a blow to his pride and his power. He wouldn't let it stand. "We need help," she said. "Real help. More than just the two of us. I'll ride to the Hendersons, the Fletchers, anyone who might stand with us. But Margaret—" He paused, his expression softening slightly. "This could go bad. Really bad. If you want to take Emma and leave, hide her somewhere else." "Where?" Margaret challenged. "Where could we go that Hendrix couldn't find us?" "No, Caleb. We make our stand here. Together. That's what we agreed to when I said yes to you." Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, fear mixed with pride and love all tangled together. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known." "I'm the stubbornest," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." Caleb left within the hour, riding hard for the neighboring ranches. Margaret stayed behind, keeping watch and checking on Emma, who slept fitfully, crying out in her dreams. Each time she woke, Margaret was there with water and soft words until she settled again. It was late afternoon when the first riders appeared on the horizon. Margaret's heart jumped into her throat until she recognized Ben Fletcher and his two sons, all of them armed. Behind them came the Hendersons, husband, wife, and grown daughter, followed by 3 more ranchers whose cattle were currently grazing on row land. By sunset, they had 12 people gathered at the ranch, all of them understanding what they were risking by being there. "Hendrix won't like this," Ben Fletcher said, stating the obvious. "He'll see it as a declaration." "It is a declaration," Caleb replied. "We're declaring that women aren't property to be claimed by force. That's a line worth defending." "Easy to say when it's not your land on the line," another rancher pointed out. "Hendrix can make things real difficult for anyone who crosses him." "He's already making things difficult," Margaret said, stepping into the circle of men. "He burned our barn. He's trying to force Caleb off his land. He beat that girl half to death because she dared say no to him. How much worse does it have to get before we stop calling it business and start calling it what it is? Tyranny?" The ranchers exchanged glances. Margaret could see the calculation in their eyes, the weighing of profit against principle. She understood it. These were practical men with families to feed and properties to protect. Standing against Hendrix was a luxury they might not be able to afford. "I'm not asking you to fight," Margaret continued. "I'm asking you to stand, to be witnesses. Hendrix operates in shadows and secrets, using fear to keep people quiet. But if we all stand together, if we all see what he does and we all speak the truth of it, he loses that power." "And if he brings the sheriff?" someone asked. "Then we tell the truth to the sheriff too," Margaret said. "Emma Cartwright is here of her own free will, seeking refuge from a man who hurt her. That's not a crime. Forcing her back would be. The sheriff won't see it that way if Hendrix has him paid off." "Maybe not," Margaret agreed. "But there are newspapers in Fresno and Sacramento. There are people who care about justice even if the local law doesn't. We make enough noise, tell the truth loud enough, and eventually someone has to listen." Ben Fletcher looked at her with something like respect. "You really believe that? That the truth matters more than money and power?" "I have to believe it," Margaret said simply. "Because if it's not true, then nothing means anything, and we might as well all give up right now." A long silence fell. Then Ben nodded slowly. "All right, I'll stay. Bear witness, like you said. But if bullets start flying, I'm taking my boys and getting out. I won't die for another man's fight." "Fair enough," Caleb said. "Anyone else?" One by one, the others agreed. Some reluctantly, some with conviction, but all of them choosing to stay. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. They weren't alone. Not anymore. Hendricks arrived the next morning with 8 men, all armed. They formed a line across the road leading to the ranch, blocking any escape. Hendricks sat his horse in the center, looking every inch the prosperous businessman playing at being a frontier strongman. Caleb, Margaret, and their allies stood on the porch, weapons visible but not raised. Emma was inside, watching through a window with terrified eyes. "Caleb Rowe!" Hendricks called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "You're harboring stolen property. Return the girl, and we'll overlook this unfortunate incident." "Emma Cartwright is a free woman, not property," Caleb called back, "and she's here seeking refuge from a man who assaulted her. She's staying until she decides otherwise." "The girl is confused. She agreed to marry me, then got cold feet. It's a private matter between me and my intended." "That's a lie," Emma's voice rang out from inside the house. She appeared at the door, supported by Margaret. Her face was still a mess of bruises, her eyes still swollen. "I never agreed to anything. You tried to force yourself on me, and when I fought back, you beat me." Several of Hendricks' men shifted uncomfortably. Whatever story he'd told them, seeing Emma's injuries made it harder to swallow. "The girl is hysterical," Hendricks said smoothly. "She doesn't know what she's saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Emma stepped forward, her voice stronger now. "You held me prisoner for 3 days. You told me I had no choice, that my father had already agreed to the marriage. When I tried to leave, you hit me. You said I belonged to you, that you'd teach me to be obedient. Those were your words, Mr. Hendricks, your exact words." "Lies told by a foolish girl trying to cover her own poor decisions," Hendricks said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Too many witnesses were hearing this, seeing Emma's injuries. "Then let's take it to the law," Margaret suggested loudly. "Let's bring the sheriff out here. Let Emma tell her story officially. If she's lying, surely the truth will come out." Hendricks's expression hardened. "I don't need the sheriff to reclaim what's mine." "She's not yours," Caleb said flatly, "and you're not taking her." "I have 8 men, Roe. How many do you have?" "A dozen at most, half of them old ranchers who've never shot at anything but rabbits. You really want to die for a girl you barely know?" "I'll die defending what's right," Caleb said. "Will your men die defending your pride?" Murmuring broke out among Hendricks's hired guns. They were being paid to intimidate, maybe to burn a few buildings, but shooting it out with a dozen armed people over a girl their boss claimed as property. That was a different calculation. "Double wages to every man who stays," Hendricks snapped, sensing the hesitation. "Triple wages won't matter if you're dead," one of the guns said, and turned his horse around. 2 others followed immediately. The remaining 5 looked uncertain. Hendricks's face went purple with rage. "You're all fired, every one of you!" "Can't fire a man who quits," the first one called back, and they rode off. Left with only 5 men, Hendricks's advantage had evaporated. He sat his horse, breathing hard, clearly trying to decide if pride was worth the risk. "This isn't over," he finally said. "That girl is mine by right, and I'll have her back. You're all witnesses to theft and conspiracy. The law will hear about this." "Good," Margaret said. "Let's get the law involved. Let's get everyone involved. Let's tell the whole valley what kind of man you are, Mr. Hendricks. What you do to women who dare refuse you." Hendricks' eyes locked on hers, and Margaret saw murder there, pure, undisguised hatred. She'd made an enemy for life, but she didn't care. Some things were worth making enemies over. "You'll regret this, old woman," Hendricks said softly. "I'll make sure of it." "Regret standing up to a bully?" Margaret smiled coldly. "I don't think so. I've spent too many years regretting staying silent. I'm done with that." Hendricks wheeled his horse and rode off, his remaining men following. The assembled ranchers stayed alert until the riders disappeared over the horizon, then slowly began to relax. "That went better than I expected," Ben Fletcher said. "Though he's right about one thing. This isn't over." "I know," Caleb agreed, "but we bought time. Time to figure out our next move." Emma collapsed against Margaret, sobbing with relief. Thank you. I was so scared he'd—" "Shh," Margaret soothed her. "He's gone. You're safe." But even as she said it, Margaret knew it wasn't entirely true. Hendricks wouldn't let this go. His pride wouldn't allow it. He'd come back, and next time he'd be smarter about it. They needed a permanent solution, not just a temporary standoff. That night, after Emma had been settled with some food and laudanum for the pain, Margaret sat at the kitchen table trying to think. Caleb joined her, both of them too wired to sleep. "We can't keep her here forever," Caleb said. "Eventually Hendricks will find a way to get to her, or he'll make it too dangerous for her to stay. So we need to make sure she has somewhere else to go," Margaret said. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere Hendricks can't reach." She said her father works for Hendricks. What about her mother? "Dead, according to Emma. She's got an aunt in Nevada, but no way to contact her safely." Margaret drummed her fingers on the table, thinking. Then an idea struck her. What if we made this public? Really public. Not just the ranchers, everyone. If enough people know Emma's story, know what Hendricks did, he can't make her disappear without proving every word of it true. How do we do that? The newspaper in Fresno. We take Emma there, have her tell her story to a reporter. Once it's in print, Hendricks can't suppress it. Caleb frowned. He could claim she's lying, say we coached her. He could, Margaret agreed, but her injuries aren't lies. The bruises, the split lip, the cracked ribs, a doctor could document all of it. Medical evidence that someone beat her badly, combine that with her testimony and the testimony of everyone who saw her arrive here, and Hendricks has a problem. He also has money and connections. He could pay the newspaper not to run the story. Maybe the one in Fresno, but what about Sacramento, San Francisco? We send the story to multiple papers, make copies of the medical report, get it into enough hands that he can't buy everyone's silence. Caleb stared at her. You've thought about this. I've had 3 years of nothing but time to think, Margaret said. Thomas controlled me through isolation and silence. He made sure I had no voice, no way to tell anyone what was happening. I won't let that happen to Emma, or anyone else. This could backfire, Caleb warned, could make Hendricks even more dangerous. Or it could expose him for what he is. Either way, Emma deserves her truth to be heard. They discussed it through the night, refining the plan, considering angles and obstacles. By morning, they had a strategy. It was risky and relied on several things going right, but it was better than just waiting for Hendricks's next move. Emma was terrified when they explained it to her, but also determined. If my story can help other women, she said, her voice shaking but firm, then I'll tell it. I'll tell everyone. They made the trip to Fresno 3 days later with Margaret and Emma in the wagon and Caleb riding alongside with his rifle across his lap. Ben Fletcher and his sons came too, providing additional protection. The doctor they found was a woman, Dr. Patricia Chen, one of the few female physicians in California. She examined Emma thoroughly, documented every injury, and wrote a detailed medical report that left no doubt someone had beaten the girl severely. This kind of damage doesn't come from a fall or an accident, Dr. Chen said, her voice tight with controlled anger. This is sustained violence. Multiple blows to the face and body, some of them while the victim was already down. Will you testify to that if needed? Margaret asked. I'll do more than testify, Dr. Chen said. I'll make copies of this report and send them to every medical society in the state. Men like Hendricks rely on silence and fear. Let's give him neither. The newspaper reporter, a young man named James Whitmore, listened to Emma's story with growing outrage. He took extensive notes, asked pointed questions, and treated Emma with a respect Margaret suspected was rare for young women in her position. This is a hell of a story, Whitmore said when Emma finished. Begging your pardon, miss, but it's the kind of thing people need to hear. May I ask, why come forward now? Why not report this to the sheriff immediately? Emma glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. Because the sheriff works for Hendricks, Emma said clearly. Half the law in this valley works for him, one way or another. I tried going to my father, but he refused to help because he needs his job. I had nowhere to turn except the kindness of strangers who had the courage to stand up to a powerful man. Whitmore scribbled furiously. And these strangers are? Caleb and Margaret Rowe, Emma said. They took me in when I had nothing, protected me when Hendricks came with guns. They're good people, and they deserve to have their story told too. The article ran 3 days later, front page of the Fresno paper with a headline that read, local land baron accused of assault and false imprisonment. It included Emma's full account, the medical report, and interviews with several of the ranchers who'd witnessed Hendrix's attempt to reclaim Emma by force. Margaret bought 6 copies and mailed them to papers in Sacramento, San Francisco, and Los Angeles with cover letters explaining the situation. 2 of them picked up the story. Within a week, half the state knew Marcus Hendrix's name, and none of it was flattering. Hendrix responded exactly as Margaret expected, with fury and legal threats. He sued the newspapers for libel, sued Dr. Chen for breaking patient confidentiality, and sued the Rose for harboring a fugitive from justice. None of it stuck. The newspapers had published truth backed by evidence. Dr. Chen had Emma's written permission, and Emma wasn't a fugitive, she was a victim seeking refuge. What Hendrix didn't expect was the public backlash. Women's groups took up Emma's cause. Churches preached against men who abused their power. Other victims started coming forward with their own stories about Hendrix and his associates. The consortium he represented quietly distanced itself. His political connections went silent. The sheriff who'd been in his pocket suddenly couldn't remember ever knowing the man. Marcus Hendrix, who'd terrorized the valley for years, was suddenly toxic. It took 6 weeks for the full collapse. His creditors, sensing weakness, called in his debts. His business partners pulled out of joint ventures. His hired men found employment elsewhere. By late November, Hendrix was broken, and being investigated by a territorial judge who'd read about the case and decided it warranted official attention. The last Margaret heard, he'd left California entirely, fleeing ahead of formal charges. Emma stayed with them through all of it, helping around the ranch and slowly healing. She was different from the terrified girl who'd stumbled into their yard. Stronger, more confident, more willing to trust her own judgment. "I want to be like you," she told Margaret one evening as they worked together preparing dinner. "I want to be someone who doesn't back down." "You already are," Margaret said. "You fought back when Hendrix attacked you. You ran when you had the chance. You told your story even though you were terrified. That's not weakness, Emma. That's incredible strength." "But I was so scared." "Being scared and doing it anyway is what courage is," Margaret interrupted. "Brave isn't the absence of fear. It's being afraid and refusing to let that stop you." Emma absorbed this, then smiled slightly. "Is that what you did? When you stood on that auction block?" Margaret thought back to that day, to the humiliation and despair, and the small, stubborn part of her that had refused to completely break. "Yes," she said. "I was terrified, but I was also angry. And eventually, angry became stronger than scared." "Will that happen to me?" "It already is," Margaret assured her. "Give it time." In December, Emma's aunt finally responded to the letters they'd sent. She was coming to California to collect Emma and bring her back to Nevada, where she ran a boarding house and could always use help. Emma cried when she told Margaret she was leaving, but they were tears of relief more than sadness. "You saved my life," she said, hugging Margaret fiercely. "I'll never forget that." "You saved your own life," Margaret corrected. "We just gave you a safe place to stand while you did it." On the day Emma left, the whole valley seemed to come by to wish her well. Women brought gifts, clothes, food for the journey, small tokens of affection. Men tipped their hats respectfully. Even people who'd previously been too scared to cross Hendrix found their courage now that he was gone. "You did this," Caleb said quietly to Margaret as they watched Emma's wagon disappear down the road. "You changed everything." "We did this," Margaret corrected. "All of us together." Caleb turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "I meant what I said before, about marrying you. The proposal still stands, if you'll have me." Margaret looked up at this man who'd taken a chance on her when no one else would, who'd stood beside her through fires and threats and impossible odds, who saw her not as a burden or a convenience, but as a partner worth keeping. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, Caleb Rowe, on one condition." "What's that?" "We do it soon. I've wasted enough of my life waiting for the right moment. I'd like to actually live the time I have left." Caleb smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "How about next week?" "Perfect," Margaret said, and kissed him right there in the yard, not caring who might see or what they might say. She was done caring about that. done living her life according to other people's rules and judgments. She was 56 years old, marrying a man half her age, and she'd never been happier. Let the world make of that what it would. They were married on a crisp December morning with half the valley in attendance. Margaret wore Sarah's wedding dress, altered to fit her shorter frame, and carried wildflowers that somehow still bloomed despite the cold. Caleb wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed with an iron heated on the stove, looking more nervous than Margaret had ever seen him. The ceremony took place on the porch of the ranch house they'd fought so hard to keep. Ben Fletcher's wife had insisted on baking a cake, and the other ranch women had brought enough food to feed twice the number of guests. It was simple and honest, and nothing like the grand affair Margaret's first wedding had been 40 years earlier. It was perfect. "Do you, Margaret Ellis, take this man to be your husband?" the circuit preacher asked. He was an old man who'd known hard times himself and didn't bat an eye at the age difference. "I do," Margaret said clearly, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "And do you, Caleb Rowe, take this woman to be your wife?" "I do," Caleb said, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Son, you may kiss your bride." Caleb did, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks but couldn't stop smiling. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she thought about Thomas, about the people in Merced who'd watched her be auctioned off like livestock. She hoped they heard about this, hoped they choked on it. The celebration lasted well into the evening. People ate and drank and told stories, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt like she belonged somewhere. Not as a servant or a burden or a charity case, but as a valued member of a community, as someone who mattered. "Speech!" someone called out as the sun began to set. Caleb looked panicked, but Margaret squeezed his hand. "Together," she whispered. They stood up, and the crowd quieted. Caleb cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, "but I want to thank you all for being here, for standing with us when things got hard, for proving that there's still such a thing as community, as looking out for each other." He paused, then continued. "When Sarah died, I thought my life was over, thought the best parts were behind me, and all that was left was just going through the motions until I died too. Then I met Margaret, and she showed me I was wrong, showed me that life doesn't end just because it gets hard, that there's always a reason to keep fighting, keep trying, keep hoping." He turned to Margaret, his voice roughening with emotion. "You saved me, Margaret Rowe. In every way a person can be saved, and I promise I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of that." Margaret felt her throat close up. She'd never been good with public speaking, but these people deserved to hear her truth. "I stood on an auction block 4 months ago," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I was told I was worthless, too old to matter, a burden nobody wanted, and I believed it, at least a little bit. I thought maybe they were right, maybe I really was used up and finished." She looked around at the faces watching her, friends now, people who'd risked their own safety to stand with her. "But Caleb gave me a choice that day. Not charity, not pity, a choice. The chance to be useful again, to matter again. And all of you," her voice caught, "all of you showed me that community isn't about owing debts or following power. It's about standing together when it matters, about choosing right over easy." She wiped tears from her cheeks. "I came to this ranch with nothing. No money, no family that wanted me, no future I could see. Now I have a home, a husband, friends, a life worth living. So thank you. Thank you for seeing me as a person when the world said I wasn't worth seeing." The applause was thunderous. Several women were crying openly. Even some of the hardened ranchers had to wipe their eyes. As the party continued around them, Margaret and Caleb slipped away to the porch, needing a moment of quiet together. "Think we scandalized anyone?" Caleb asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Probably," Margaret said, "and I don't care even a little bit." "Good, because I intend to scandalize them a lot more over the years." Margaret laughed, the sound free and genuine. "Years, plural? You're that sure we'll last?" "I'm that sure I want to try," Caleb said. "Margaret, I know we haven't known each other long. I know people will say this is too fast, too crazy, but I've never been more certain of anything. You're my partner, my equal, the person I want beside me for whatever time we have left." "However long that is," Margaret agreed, resting her head against his shoulder. They stood there watching the stars come out, listening to the celebration behind them wind down as guests began heading home. Tomorrow they'd go back to work. The ranch didn't stop needing attention just because they'd gotten married, but tonight they could just be. The winter was mild that year, which was fortunate because January brought news that changed everything again. Dr. Patricia Chen arrived at the ranch unannounced on a gray morning, her medical bag in hand and an expression Margaret couldn't quite read on her face. "Mrs. Rowe," she said formally, "I hope I'm not intruding, but I needed to speak with you about a medical matter." Margaret's first thought was that something was wrong with Emma, but Dr. Chen quickly dispelled that. "Your young friend is fine. Thriving, from what I hear. This is about you." "Me? I'm not sick." "No," Dr. Chen agreed. "But when you brought Emma to see me, I noticed certain signs. Signs I'm trained to recognize. With your permission, I'd like to examine you." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. What kind of signs? The kind that suggest you might be with child. The words hung in the air like something impossible. Margaret stared at Dr. Chen, certain she'd misheard. "That's not possible," she said flatly. "I'm 56 years old. Women my age don't. They can't." "It's rare," Dr. Chen acknowledged. "Very rare. But not impossible. I've seen it twice before in my practice. Women who believed they were past childbearing age suddenly finding themselves pregnant. May I examine you?" Margaret felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Pregnant? At her age? It was absurd. Impossible. Terrifying. And yet, she thought about the nausea she'd been experiencing for weeks, which she'd attributed to stress, the exhaustion that seemed heavier than usual, the changes in her body she'd dismissed as normal aging. "All right," she heard herself say. "Examine me." 20 minutes later, Dr. Chen confirmed what Margaret had already started to suspect deep in her bones. "You're approximately 3 months along," the doctor said gently. "Based on the examination, I'd estimate the baby will come in late May or early June." Margaret sat down heavily, her mind reeling. A baby. At 56. After believing that part of her life was decades behind her. "Is it—" She had to stop, swallow hard. "Is it safe? At my age?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, her expression serious. "I won't lie to you, Margaret. Pregnancy at your age carries risks. Higher risk of complications, difficult labor, health problems for both you and the child. But I've seen women your age deliver healthy babies. It's possible. It's just not guaranteed. What should I do?" "That's entirely your choice," Dr. Chen said firmly. "But whatever you decide, you should make that decision with full information. I'll support you either way." After the doctor left, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, her hands pressed against her still flat stomach, trying to process what she'd just learned. A baby. She'd raised 3 children already, buried a husband, survived poverty and humiliation and violence. She was supposed to be done with this part of life. But life, it seemed, had other plans. Caleb found her there an hour later, still sitting motionless at the table. "Margaret, Dr. Chen said she needed to talk to you about something. Is everything all right?" Margaret looked up at him, this man who'd become her whole world in just a few short months. She saw his concern, his love, his trust in her. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Caleb froze. For a long moment, he just stared at her, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, wonder, and fear in rapid succession. How is that possible?" "Apparently it's rare, but not impossible." Dr. Chen confirmed it. "I'm about 3 months along." Caleb sat down across from her, his legs apparently no longer willing to hold him. "A baby. We're having a baby." "If the pregnancy goes well," Margaret said, Dr. Chen was honest about the risks. "At my age, there are complications that—" "Do you want this?" Caleb interrupted. "That's the only question that matters. Do you want to have this baby?" Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. She was 56 years old with a hard life behind her and an uncertain future ahead. She'd raised children before, knew how exhausting and demanding it was. She was supposed to be past all this. But when she imagined it, a child with Caleb's eyes, a new life built from their impossible love, something fierce and protective rose up in her chest. Yes, she said. I know it's crazy. I know all the reasons it's a terrible idea, but yes, I want this, if you do. Caleb's face split into the widest smile Margaret had ever seen on him. Want it? Margaret, I never thought, after Sarah, I assumed children were something I'd never have. This is a gift, a miracle. A terrifying miracle, Margaret said, but she was smiling too. What are people going to say? That we're either blessed or insane. Probably both, Caleb laughed. Let them say whatever they want. We're having a baby, Margaret. Our baby. He pulled her into his arms, and Margaret let herself be held, let herself feel the joy and terror and wonder all mixed together. This wasn't how she'd expected her life to go. This wasn't the quiet, peaceful ending she'd resigned herself to. This was so much better. The pregnancy was not easy. Margaret's body, which had carried 3 children decades ago, protested this new burden. She was sick constantly through the 4th month, exhausted beyond anything she'd experienced before. Her back ached, her feet swelled, and every minor discomfort was magnified by the knowledge that she was attempting something most women her age wouldn't survive. But she was stubborn and determined and absolutely refusing to let fear win. Dr. Chen visited monthly, monitoring Margaret's health and the baby's development. Each visit brought new concerns and new reassurances in equal measure. The baby was growing well. Margaret's heart was strong. The risk remained high, but they were managing it. Word of the pregnancy spread through the valley like wildfire. The reactions were predictable: shock, judgment, concern, and in some quarters, barely concealed disgust that a woman Margaret's age would dare to carry a child. Margaret ignored it all. She'd learned that lesson well by now. Other people's opinions didn't feed her animals or work her land or warm her bed at night. Their disapproval couldn't touch the happiness she felt when Caleb put his hand on her growing stomach and felt their child move. By April, Margaret was enormous and uncomfortable and thoroughly done with being pregnant. She couldn't work in the garden anymore, couldn't help with the heavy ranch work, could barely walk without waddling like a duck. It was humiliating and exhausting and wonderful all at once. I look ridiculous, she complained one evening as Caleb helped her into a chair. You look beautiful, he said, and meant it. You're biased. Absolutely, Caleb agreed. Also right. Emma visited in May, traveling from Nevada specifically to be there for the birth. She'd filled out in the months away, her face free of bruises and full of confidence. Working with her aunt had been good for her. I had to come, she told Margaret. You were there when I needed you. I want to be here for you too. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Emma interrupted. I want to. Besides, someone needs to keep you from working yourself to death while you're carrying that baby. I'm not working that hard. You reorganized the entire pantry yesterday, Emma said flatly, while 7 months pregnant. That's insane. It needed doing. It needed doing by someone who isn't about to give birth, Emma countered. Now sit down, put your feet up, and let me handle things for a while. Having Emma there was a blessing. She took over the household tasks Margaret could no longer manage, helped Caleb with the lighter ranch work, and provided company during the long, anxious wait for labor to begin. It started on a June morning when the sky was the color of old silver and the air smelled like rain. Margaret woke to pain that took her breath away and knew immediately what it meant. Caleb, she gasped, it's time. What followed was the longest day of Margaret's life. The pain was worse than she remembered from her previous births, or maybe she'd just forgotten how bad it was. Dr. Chen arrived within an hour, took one look at Margaret, and settled in for what she clearly expected to be a difficult labor. You're doing fine, she kept saying, which Margaret knew was a lie but appreciated anyway. Hours passed, the pain came in waves that threatened to drown her. Margaret screamed, cried, cursed, and begged for it to be over. Emma held one hand, Caleb the other, both of them looking terrified but trying to hide it. I can't, Margaret gasped during a particularly brutal contraction. I can't do this. I'm too old. I'm too tired. You can, Dr. Chen said firmly. You've survived everything life has thrown at you. You can survive this too. I don't want to just survive, Margaret sobbed. I want to live. I want to meet my baby. Then push, Dr. Chen commanded. Push and meet your child. Margaret pushed. pushed until she thought she'd break apart, pushed through pain that felt like dying, pushed until Dr. Chen shouted, "I can see the head!" One more push, one more impossible effort from a body that had nothing left to give, and then a baby's cry split the air. "It's a girl," Dr. Chen said, her voice thick with emotion as she placed the squalling, red-faced infant on Margaret's chest. "You have a daughter." Margaret looked down at the tiny, perfect creature in her arms and felt her entire world reorganize itself around this new center. She thought she knew what love was, thought she understood the depth of feeling a parent could have for a child. She'd been wrong. This was different. This was love stripped down to its most primal form, fierce and protective and absolutely overwhelming. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama. I know I'm old, and I know I'm not perfect, but I promise I'll love you with everything I have." Caleb was crying too, his hand gentle on his daughter's tiny head. "She's perfect. Margaret, she's absolutely perfect. Sarah," Margaret said suddenly, "we should name her Sarah, after your first wife. The woman who would have loved her." Caleb looked at her, his expression a mixture of grief and gratitude. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Sarah Rowe. A name that honors the past and hopes for the future." Dr. Chen finished her work efficiently, checking Margaret over with the thoroughness of someone who'd been worried about exactly this scenario. Finally, she sat back with a satisfied nod. "You're both healthy," she announced. "Exhausted and battered, but healthy. Margaret, you just did something remarkable. You should be proud." "I'm just glad it's over," Margaret admitted. But she couldn't stop looking at her daughter, couldn't stop marveling at this impossible gift. Emma brought water and clean cloths, helping Margaret get comfortable while Caleb held his daughter with the nervous care of a new father. Watching him with the baby, Margaret felt a contentment she'd never experienced before. This was what she'd been waiting for her whole life. Not the marriages or the children she'd raised before, not the years of hard work and sacrifice. This moment, this family built from nothing but stubbornness and love. The news of Sarah's birth spread through the valley with the same speed as news of the pregnancy had. People came to visit, bringing gifts and congratulations and poorly concealed shock that both mother and baby had survived. "She's beautiful," the ranch women cooed over the baby. "She's a miracle," others whispered. "She's loved," Margaret said simply, and that was all that mattered. Summer passed in a blur of sleepless nights and exhausted days. Margaret had forgotten how demanding newborns were, how they consumed every moment and every ounce of energy. But she'd also forgotten the joy. The first smile, the tiny fingers wrapped around hers, the absolute trust in those dark eyes. Caleb was a devoted father, taking shifts with the baby at night so Margaret could sleep, handling dirty diapers without complaint, singing softly to Sarah when she fussed. Watching him, Margaret fell in love with him all over again. "You're good at this," she told him one evening as he walked the floor with a cranky Sarah. "I'm terrified every second," Caleb admitted, "but I figure if I can rebuild a failing ranch, I can learn to be a decent father." "You're already a wonderful father," Margaret said. "She's lucky to have you." "We're all lucky," Caleb said, looking at Margaret with such love it made her chest ache. "Lucky to have each other. Lucky to have survived everything that tried to destroy us. Lucky to have this second chance." By autumn, the ranch was thriving. Word of their success and the story behind it had brought more business. Ranchers from across the valley brought their cattle for boarding. Margaret's preserved vegetables and baked goods sold out at the general store in Merced. They'd paid off the last of Caleb's debts in August and were finally genuinely profitable. On a crisp October afternoon, Margaret stood on the porch holding Sarah, watching Caleb work with a new horse in the corral. The baby was 6 months old now, fat and happy, and already showing signs of her father's stubborn independence. Emma had returned to Nevada but wrote regularly, full of news about her work with her aunt and the young man who'd started courting her. She was happy, thriving, building a life on her own terms. Thomas had written once, a bitter letter accusing Margaret of abandoning family and living in sin. Margaret had burned it without responding. She owed him nothing, least of all an explanation. Her other children, Mary, Ruth, and James, had sent nothing. No letters, no congratulations on her marriage or the birth of their half-sister, nothing. It hurt, but Margaret had made peace with it. They'd made their choices. She'd made hers. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, joining her on the porch after finishing with the horse. "Everything," Margaret said. "How different my life is now compared to 6 months ago, a year ago. How I went from being sold for $1 to standing here with you and our daughter with a home and a future and hope." "Regret any of it?" "Not even a little bit," Margaret said firmly. "Even the hard parts, even the scary parts. They were all worth it to get here." Caleb put his arm around her, careful not to jostle the baby. "You know what today is?" "October 15th. Why?" "It's been exactly 1 year since I paid that $1 for you at the auction," Caleb said. "Best dollar I ever spent." Margaret laughed. "Best investment you ever made, you mean?" "That too," Caleb agreed, "though I think I got the better end of that deal." They stood together watching the sun set over their land they'd fought for, bled for, refused to surrender. The new barn stood solid against the horizon. The fences were all mended. The garden was full of late-season vegetables. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. It wasn't a perfect life. There were still debts to manage, work to be done, challenges to face, but it was their life, built from nothing, defended against all odds, and absolutely worth every struggle. Sarah made a soft noise against Margaret's chest, and Margaret looked down at her daughter's face. In a few years, this child would ask questions, would want to know about the mother who'd had her so late in life, about the unusual circumstances of her parents' marriage. And Margaret would tell her the truth, would tell her about the auction block and the $1 that changed everything, about standing up to bullies and refusing to accept the world's judgment, about finding love when everyone said she was too old for it, about believing in second chances even when they seemed impossible. She'd tell Sarah that life didn't end when the world said it should, that worth wasn't determined by age or appearance or what others thought. That courage was often just stubbornness in disguise, that love could bloom in the strangest places if you were brave enough to water it. Most importantly, she'd tell Sarah that her mother had been told she was worthless, used up, too old to matter, and that her mother had proved every single one of those judgments wrong. "You're smiling," Caleb observed. "What's so funny?" "I was just thinking," Margaret said, "about what I'd say if I saw Thomas again. Or those people in Merced who watched me get auctioned off and did nothing." "What would you say?" Margaret looked at her husband, her daughter, her ranch, her life reclaimed from the edge of nothing. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for not seeing my worth. Because if you had, I might never have found my way here, might never have discovered what I was really capable of, might never have learned that the best parts of my life were still ahead of me, not behind." Caleb kissed the top of her head. "They were fools to overlook you." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "They were. But their loss was our gain." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Margaret Rowe, wife, mother, rancher, survivor, allowed herself a moment of perfect contentment. She was 57 years old. She had a 6-month-old daughter, a husband 30 years her junior, a thriving ranch, and a community that had learned to see her as she truly was. The world had tried to write her off, had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a burden, a leftover, a woman too old to matter, but Margaret had written her own ending instead, and it was more beautiful than anything the world could have imagined for her. She'd been sold for $1. She'd become priceless, and she'd finally, truly, completely come home.